Please be seated. Ms. Dugan, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Judge. I went to thrift stores a lot as a kid. My family didn't have a ton of money growing up, so we were shopping at thrift stores like way before it was trending on TikTok. And mostly what I was buying at thrift stores was clothes, but every now and then we'd get the occasional game. I'm not gonna sit here and tell you I ever bought a puzzle from a thrift store because I haven't. And you can insert whatever joke you want about a defense attorney being bad at lying, but I'm not gonna do that to you today. But I remember I got this game called Mousetrap at the thrift store. And I don't know if you all are familiar with that game at all, but it's like a board game and it's set up in this sort of intricate way, and there's like a bathtub and a boot that like kicks a little silver ball through all of this contraption essentially as part of this game. I loved that game. It was so fun because really what I would do is just like set it up and play with it. To this day though, I don't know how to play the game because it didn't come with all of the parts because it was at a thrift store and it was like $1.50. And so I like to set it up, but I like to like run it through everything. But I don't actually know what the real parts are as part of that game. And I tell you that because as a kid, it's all well and good to play a game that doesn't have all of the parts because it's fun, it's just whatever. But you know what's not okay to have missing parts from? A criminal case where my client is charged with rape. And there are a lot of missing parts to this case. And I do have to apologize, I will be referring to my notes every now and then because I get one chance to talk to you all today. State gets rebuttal. So they get to talk to you again, they get to listen to my closing, and then they get to sort of tailor stuff. But I get one shot to talk to you all, and this is important, and I want to make sure that you have all of the information that you need. So, at this point, I'm going to abandon the game analogy, like, just for your all's sake. But what I'm really trying to impress upon you all is that the missing pieces in this case are huge and troublesome. And I think that really the easiest way to highlight these issues is to talk about the timeline. But before we get to the timeline, I want to provide a framework for really what the state is asking you to do today. They're asking you to believe when they say that Nick raped them. And I put the two of them together in my little spiel for a reason. Because even though you have a jury instruction that says you are not permitted testimony for the truth of what they're saying their truth is, you're allowed to consider it about whether or not testimony was recently fabricated. But the state is having both of them testify in this trial by design. Because it is hard to disentangle and to reconcile two women that would be saying that Nick sexually assaulted them in 2008. And that is purposeful, that is intentional, to explain to the jury, to have you all consider two people's testimony when really what you're here to decide is what. So let's move through the timeline. Early September 2008, gets a TBI. She takes time off of work. She stops dancing. She is sleeping a lot. Had already been living with her parents, but she was living with her parents. Her mom took an entire month off to help her recover. So, a little out of order, September 14th, just because I think it's helpful for context, September 14th, 2008, that's when she reported to police that she said Nick sexually assaulted her, okay? Moving back to early to mid-November 2008, meet on Craigslist. She sees his profile. She finds it compelling. They start chatting on Craigslist, AOL Instant Messenger, and they start texting. Then November 21st, 2008, they actually meet in person. And that date is significant. We know that this is solid because that's, so she spends her birthday with him, and then 6 days later, Nick comes to her house and meets her parents and her grandparents on a holiday, and they have Thanksgiving dinner together. So that's the first time that her family ever encounters him. Mom said that she portrayed him as a friend. Dad said that was her boyfriend. Regardless, she brought him over to meet parents, like 6 days after she meets him. And then November 28th, 2008, the next day, like 17 hours after they'd had a meal together, they go to Morgan Jewelers and they finance rings. They're getting married. They are engaged to get married right after that happens. So you'll notice, and we'll come back to this, there's a gap in between November 28th and December 13th, 2008, because based on the phone records provided, she changes her name, or excuse me, her number for the first time on December 13th of 2008. Then, fast forward 9 days or so, she then files a small claims action against Nick, which I want to pause for a moment. It's pretty clear in her testimony that relationship over, engagement done on Christmas Eve. And like that makes sense, like the state said. Why would you be suing your fiance, somebody that you loved? So I think that we can take her for her word on that one. But here's the problem, and here's what the state sort of glossed over, right? Is that on December 26, 2008, that's when the eviction case against Nick and his roommates are filed. But, like Eric testified to, it's not until December 29, 2008 that they're actually served, that they're actually given notice that they gotta vacate the Orem apartment. And so this timeline really matters because in order for it to be true, what has said, that was the weirdest thing I've ever said, I'm sorry, but you know what I'm saying, is between November 29th and December 24th is when the sexual assault allegedly occurred. Ties December 13th, 2008 as the day after that he had sexually assaulted her the day or two before that occurred. But here's the state's issue. He is in Orem when this is allegedly occurring. There is no evidence tying Nick to the Blair Street address in December until January 21st, 2009. There is a document that notes that Nick was living at the Blair Street address, which again, I will also note, we are not saying that he didn't know, he didn't live in Utah at the time, but the state cannot put Nick in the Blair Street address until January of 2009. And in fact, what Mr. Hyder said to you is, don't get caught up in whether or not this happened in December or January. Don't get caught up in those small details. That is a huge detail. Whether or not he actually was at the Blair Street address. And we'll get to how we even get to Blair Street in a second, but that is significant, okay? Additionally, part of the timeline, March 25th, 2009, that's testified that she changed her number for the second time because she is still communicating with the man who forcibly, violently raped her multiple months after it occurred, after she sues him, after this horrible thing happens to her, she still talks to him. And eventually that fritters out and they never hear from each other again until Detective Coach, January 14th of 2022, when she sees him in the news and is like, that's my crappy ex-boyfriend. That's the guy who made me pay for everything, who was saying that he was LDS, but like wasn't really acting like somebody who she probably perceived would have been LDS, right? And so I want to hit pause, actually, and talk a little bit more about the relationship, because there's not really much to talk about. Because it is such a quick whirlwind romance where they meet online, they meet a week later, he meets her parents, they get engaged, and then they break up in the span of like a month. And that really is, that sort of behavior, I want you to think about the kind of person and the judgment of somebody who does that. So for example, there's a show called 90 Day Fiancé, right? I have seen like one episode of it, but my understanding is it's this reality TV show, and at some point somebody is like flown to the United States and they had like chatted a little bit online prior to that, but they have a dating range of 90 days. And then at the end, I think they decide either to get married or not get married. And the details of that really don't matter, but I just shared that with you because like a lot of people watch the show. And they watch the show because of the bizarre factor of it. I mean, a lot of us watch reality TV because we like to see the insane things that people do, right? And 90 Day Fiancé is no different because we as a society find that so odd, to find that so irreconcilable with the understanding of how you pick a partner for life, and not just for life here, like for time and eternity. For us to find a partner, that is bizarre behavior. It's very odd. So I want to take a step back and talk a little bit more about the actual event, okay? So testified that their relationship really was fine. She liked him, she found him charming. But then, like one day at the gateway, everything changes. And he is screaming at her, he is aggressive with her, he is in public, and she finally decides like, I have had it, I'm done. She takes her ring off, she throws it in her bag, she storms back to her car. Totally fine, right? I mean, if you're really in that sort of fight with your partner, you absolutely get to walk away, for sure. But then she gets in her car, walks in, and he's apparently like making a huge scene, banging on it, kicking, screaming, and she doesn't try to leave. And perhaps she's a nicer person than I am. But like, she had an opportunity to leave, it's her car, she didn't. She then lets him into her car, and he apparently continues to just scream at her and get in her face, and there's some drive in between the gateway to going back to Blair Street. And then they apparently sit at Blair Street for an hour in the cold, in December. The car's off, and she sits there and just like allows him to apparently scream at her in this way. But after all of that, she then goes into his house, she goes into his bedroom, and she's wanting to discuss, I guess at this point, breaking up. And here's my problem with this, is the state sort of characterized Nick as he is the one convincing her to do these things. And you heard me testify earlier that she had been controlled by men her whole life. And this is my problem, is that she has zero agency in this narrative that the state has crafted for you. That she was forced into doing all of these things that she didn't want to do, that she was forced into buying these rings, that she was forced into putting him in her car, that she was forced into continuing on in a relationship that she didn't want to be in, and that he forced her to come into the house and into the bedroom, and then he forced himself to have sex with her. But he does have agency in this situation. And I'm not trying to do the, well, she didn't say no, because it's actually a lot more complicated and nuanced than that. Because he was a willing participant in their relationship from day one. And so this idea of reducing the defense's argument to, oh, it's just a woman's scorn, you know how women are. Like that's certainly not what we're arguing, okay? So what I do think, though, because the state talked a lot about this in their closing, and I'm sure that Mr. Simmons will get up and talk about it again, is the whole idea of like, why would she lie, right? And ultimately, that's not an element of rape. That is something perhaps you can consider in evaluating the credibility of testimony, but ultimately, why somebody would lie, you may never know the answer to that question in general. I mean, we all know many human beings, men or women, who lie, who tell tall tales. And the gain of that lie may not be immediately apparent to you, but like, people do it. That said, I have an idea. Because when is going into the room and she's sort of saying she was talking about breaking up, and then he forces her to have sex with him, maybe they had makeup sex. And 13 years later, it is now rape. And this is why. Because it was serious to her. She thought that she was going to marry this man. It was serious. And I know that I can sort of poke into the whirlwind component of it, but at the end of the day, she opened herself up to this man, and he made her look like a fool. And that hurts. And your first heartbreak, that first feeling of like, I'm gonna spend the rest of my life with this person, and then to find out that that story that you had played forward, that's not gonna happen because he actually kind of sucks, that is something that people hold on to, regardless of if you're a man or a woman. And so, when you're deliberating, if for whatever reason you feel compelled to question why she would misremember or flat out lie about what happened, that's a suggestion for you. Because she was a willing participant in this relationship, and the characterization that Melissa has no agency and that something was just happening to her is not accurate. And indeed, she had a traumatic brain injury at the time, but what is that she was back to dance, she was back to work, and she was back to dating within a month and a half or so. When I asked her about any of the sort of standard traumatic brain injury symptoms that you tend to have, she was like, no, I slept a lot, but I didn't have memory issues, I didn't have difficulty concentrating, I didn't feel some type of way. Like, she denied that. And so for the state to call her vulnerable flies in the face of what Melissa actually said to you. And that's also borne out by what her mom testified to. I mean, her mom testified like she was a little more anxious, like groups of people were a little harder after that, but it wasn't that she needed to sort of like carry around this like hurt baby bird. That's not what was happening. She was a 25-year-old adult who was working and dating and living with her parents. And so I'd ask you to take her story that she said today and put that in the context of that. Not as some frail object that this is just happening to, but as a woman with agency and the ability to say, no, I actually don't want to do this. So, you can think that Nick sucks as a boyfriend. That's fine. That's fine. But just because somebody is bad at relationships when they're 21 years old does not mean that they're a rapist. And specifically, the biggest issue here is Blair Street and whether or not the state can put him there. So how did we even end up on Blair Street, right? And that's because we were river raft guided by detective coats there, because he knew that on January 21st, 2009, that Nick was at Blair Street. We are not saying that he didn't live at Blair Street, but Detective Coates knew that. He is the one who brings her to Blair Street. That was thoroughly explained, even though it does tell you, I knew that it was at Blair Street, I told him. That's not accurate, because that's not what happened. Because Detective Coates knew that it was Blair Street, and she had said it was in South Salt Lake, which Blair Street is not in South Salt Lake, as Detective Coates testified to. So he takes her there, and he shows her this house, and she's talking well, it was kind of set back, it was mature trees, which, and Detective testified to, that's not super descriptive of any house in Salt Lake, really. I mean, there's mature trees everywhere, which is what they both admitted, and that having a house that's kind of set back is not that unique in Salt Lake at all. So they get there. She also notes that I think there was bricks. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to like beat a dead horse on this, but that does matter. Because the aluminum siding on the house, it's gray, and there's a bunch of houses, which you can see on Defense Exhibits 1 and 2. In 2007, which you'll have an opportunity to take back with you, just so you know, there's a gray house with aluminum siding, and then the houses around it do not have brick on it. Even though Mr. Heinrich got up and had Detective Coates testify to, and it looks like brick. I mean, look at these yourself, please. I mean, like, make your own determination. Don't just take my word for it. But there's not bricks. And also, there's not bricks in the Zillow photos, because we're looking at photos of a house 15 years after the fact. She is saying his room was on the right in Blair Street. Great guess. There's two options. You can either have a room on the left or the right. And, you know, a broken clock is right twice a day. So here we are. We have photos of the house that he does not go into, that the photos are just found from Zillow. We have no idea when they were taken. We don't know what it currently looks like. We don't know if those were photos from however long ago. Like, we just don't know that. And the state wants you to, again, sort of gloss over that because the small details match. That's sort of one of their themes here, is like the small details in this case match. But like, forget about the big details. The biggest detail is that they cannot put him in the house. And in fact, what the actual evidence that came in that you'll be able to review is that their relationship ended, like romantic relationship, but they continue to talk for whatever reason, on December 24th, but he doesn't get evicted until end of December. And that matters. That is a huge part of this case, is can they even put him there, and they can't. And what the state would want you to believe is like, well, he didn't like his roommates, and he wasn't around, so he found somewhere else to live. We cannot just leap to conclusions on a rape case. They need to prove it. They can't just ask you to make reasonable inferences and hope it comes out in their favor. They need to prove it. They did not. And also, what you heard testimony like relentlessly over these past few days is that he didn't have any money. He was constantly asking for money. He took money from her. Like, this man didn't have money. How is he paying 2 rents? Where is he finding that? And again, it is the state's job to place that piece of the puzzle for you. And if they cannot do that, if they cannot prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, that is a problem. And so the state got up and said there's all of these ways in which you can find him guilty. I had like a bridge metaphor. And underneath the bridge, there were all these pillars of truth. But if you know, the pillars of truth, they all came. So the phone record that she procured, the Wayback Machine that she taught Detective Coates how to use, the Morgan Jewelers credit application, she is the one who found all of those. So wouldn't it make sense that her narrative would match what she provided to law enforcement? That he doesn't even try to like do further anything. He doesn't send preservation letters to her email account. He doesn't try to get text, phone, call logs or anything. I know it's a long time ago, but at least try. Usually we stand in this space of like trust but verify, and Detective Coates just trusted. He didn't verify any of the stuff that she brought to him because it fit his narrative. That's why he brought her to Blair Street, because it fits the narrative. So yes, of course, that's going to match because she is the one who provided it to him. I want to talk a little bit more about and her parents. Described her relationship to you all on the stand with both of her parents as problematic, as difficult. Evidently, they were arguing a lot in 2008. I told you that she described her mom as a dumb blonde, her dad as controlling. But then you actually got to hear from both of them, right? And you heard from Tammy, who said that she took an entire month off of work to help her daughter recuperate from a brain injury. That after she supposedly disclosed that she had been sexually assaulted by Nick, that she went and checked on her, said nothing, shut her down, and then there was no follow-up. Tammy testified that she loves her daughter, that she cares for her, and I think a caring mom like that, if that had happened, would have followed up with her daughter. So I think it's safe to say that that didn't happen. You also heard from Joe, who testified of his own admission, like, yeah, we don't really have a relationship anymore, but she's still my kid and I still love her. It tells you this really inflammatory thing that her dad said to her. And the state wants you to sort of write that off as, well, misremembering and it was the heat of the moment. But both her parents testified like they weren't fighting that much. That they didn't perceive their interactions to be this knockdown, drag out fight, because what you is they had had very rare non-fight interactions. And said is that the conversation about the rings and the debt that she carried, that was not a fight. Mom and dad say that it was. And so it does seem kind of has an axe to grind for the people in her life. She characterizes her mom in a specific way, despite her mom helping her through her injury. She characterizes her dad in a specific type of way, despite coming here and saying that if he had heard that his daughter had been raped by Nick, he absolutely would have remembered that. And I think while we're talking about common sense that the state wants you to apply to all of this, I think as a parent, you would remember that. So, I want to talk briefly about again, the testimony. I'm not necessarily here to like pick apart every piece of it, because really what the state wants you to consider it for is to show that they don't think she fabricated her allegations. There are inconsistencies in what it says, right? She notes that when they had broken up, but they are continuing to have contact with one another, which is fine, like they wanted to remain friends. But then they had consensual sex September 12th, which again, fine, like you can have sex with people that you're not dating. Because she's trying to get her money back from him. Like that's sort of a theme also between, like, you want to talk about similarities. These two women do have problems because he either steals, they say that he steals money from them or he owes them money. And so she goes to his house, they have consensual sex, she spends the night, she wakes up, she goes to class, she's still like, hey, can you please give me the money back? And then again, goes to his home, goes into his bedroom, and he just out of the blue overpowers her and sexually assaults her. And what the state sort of wants you to show these similarities between the nature of the assaults, like that's most sexual assaults, right? I mean, if somebody doesn't want to have sex with another person and they are saying that they are overpowered by that other person, what these two women describe does not have particularities of detail. That he held them down and that he allegedly took their pants off. Like, those are not complicated details. And so again, the state really wants you to focus on these small details in the hope that you will overlook the glaring holes in what they have failed to provide and prove to you today. Additionally, never tells Sergeant Stewart that she had been around her throat, that he had allegedly like bent her, like folded her like a sandwich, essentially. Like that was never told to Sergeant Stewart. And as Sergeant Stewart is investigating this case, she encounters and she explains to Sergeant Stewart, oh yeah, I went out to dinner with him afterwards and he gave me my money back. So she declined to screen those charges for prosecution. And I think really more so the declination of the screening, it's more that continues to see him. And she denied that on the stand today. But then you also had, I guess, former Sergeant Stewart, who clearly did not want to be here today and has no dog in this fight, as it were, just reading off of her report, like, that is what was told to me, that is what I documented, that's what I was supposed to do as law enforcement, and so I did it. Like, she doesn't have an opinion one way or the other. And so, tells former Sergeant Stewart is like, yeah, you're right, that does look kind of bad. And there's no follow-up from about the declining to file charges. But now here we are, and I guess now it's 2025, but the charges filed in 2022, litigating a case that at this point is 17 years old, but at the time was 13. And that leads me to my next point, which is that the state is very comfortable telling you that because this case is so old, it's totally fine that people's memories don't drive. And that we need to give people a lot of wiggle room and grant the state some amount of grace in not having the big parts of this case fit. That is a problem. You need to hold the state to their burden because the big facts matter. And if you, at the end of this, are feeling unsatisfied with the information that you have received, that is on the state. That is not on the defendant. And it is their job to leave you firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt. I want to touch briefly on this idea that there's like consciousness of guilt because he changed his name and lived somewhere else. He left the country, he moved to another place, the United Kingdom, in 2017. So 9 years after these allegations. I don't know how they're bringing consciousness of guilt to something that happens 9 years after the fact. They claim he assumed a new identity, he lived somewhere else. Like, you're allowed to move. You're allowed to go somewhere else, you're allowed to have a different name. That's allowed. And what the state has, again, not provided to you is how that is consciousness of guilt, other than just like wild speculation. And if you want to engage in the wild speculation, I suppose that's fine, but really at the end of the day, do you think that someone who leaves the country and changes their name 9 years after something that happened in your early 20s is consciousness of guilt? Like, really? And so again, the state has this bridge and the pillars of truth, but most of them are faulty pillars of truth. So, lastly, I want to talk to you about what beyond a reasonable doubt means. It's sort of something you hear on like Law and Order, and it's such a lawyer definition, right? It's proof that leaves you firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt. But like, what does that actually really mean? And ultimately, it's up to you what that comes down to. In my mind, it comes down to the credibility and whether or not her story matches the actual evidence that was introduced in this trial, and whether or not it makes sense based on the timeline. Because at the end of the day, nobody can put Nick at the Blair Street address in December of 2008, which is when it is very clear their relationship was over. And I want you to think about the credibility of it also in the way that he interacts with Nick after he allegedly violently assaults her. That she is continuing to talk to this man that she apparently is terrified of, that she is so scared of. but after he rapes her, she gets up and says goodbye and leaves? Weigh that in your credibility determination. Think about that when you're thinking about and how it fits in light of the actual evidence in this case. Because again, the state's gonna get up here again and say, well, there's these small details that matter. If you worked at Chili's, like, he had a family member named Charles, like, that's fine. But you cannot convict on small details. And the state hasn't provided to you or proved beyond a reasonable doubt what those large details actually are, because they don't exist. So ultimately, how I conceptualize of what beyond a reasonable doubt is, there are certain criminal standards in the legal system, all right, or there's certain standards, I should say, in the legal system. One of those is probable cause. Probable cause is what an officer needs to be able to arrest and charge somebody with a crime. It's a very low standard. It's sort of a like 50, 51%. Did something happen? Maybe we'll figure that out. We are not in probable cause land, right? We're going to be in beyond a reasonable doubt land. There's another standard of proof called clear and convincing evidence. And clear and convincing evidence is what the government needs to show in order to terminate your parental rights. In order for the government to prevent you from raising your children, which you have a constitutional right to do, in order for them to take that away from you, they have to show by clear and convincing evidence that you are not a fit parent. And that's a big deal to be able to terminate somebody's parental rights, right? But in the criminal legal system, we live in beyond a reasonable doubt land. And that is proof that leaves you firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt. So, like I said, if you are unsatisfied with the testimony, if you have serious questions about memory, about her motivation, about how she even ends up at Blair Street, hold the state to their verdict. That is their job. The government is going to take your liberty away to charge you with a crime. They need to come correct. And they didn't do that in this case. So it's not, maybe something happened, or like probably something's weird, but I don't quite know what it is. No, that is not enough. It is, you need to be standing in your power and saying, yes, 100%, not no percentages, but that yes, I am firmly convinced that this went down the way that they said it did. And if you have doubts that are real, that make sense in light of your common human experience, again, that's on the state. So now you all have the unenviable task of going back into a room without windows and getting lunch and deliberating amongst yourself about whether or not you believe my client is innocent or guilty of what the state is saying that he did. And so while you're in the jury room, I urge you to stay strong in your beliefs, to have an open conversation with one another, and to think critically about what the state has presented to you. Because at the end of the day, the big pieces, the facts of consequence, the things that matter in this case, they're not here. And I'm confident that when you come back in here, you will be delivering a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dugan.